I pulled into the valet circle of the most expensive hotel in Louisville on Derby weekend, carrying a toolbox my dead wife hid her secrets in. Before my boots hit the marble, my phone buzzed. A message from my own son. "Your room's canceled. Sleep in the lobby. Don't embarrass me." I read it twice. Then I smiled, walked to the front desk, and booked the suite directly above his. He had no idea what was coming. Thanks for being here. Before we continue, hit that like button, subscribe, and let me know where you are watching from. Your comments mean more than you think. Also, a quick reminder, parts of this story are creatively adapted for narrative depth, and any resemblance to actual people or events is entirely coincidental. The gravel crunched under my tires like snapping bone, a sound I should have taken as a warning before I even turned off the engine. Raymond Hollister, a 70-year-old retired construction foreman who had spent 43 years finding hidden fractures in concrete and steel, pulled my old Ford pickup into the service lot behind the Belmore Estate Hotel. I let the engine idle for a moment, the familiar diesel rattle a comfort against the suffocating grandeur of the manicured grounds stretching before me like a theater set built to impress people who had never held a shovel. My hands, calloused from decades of gripping rebar and cold scaffolding poles, felt heavy on the steering wheel. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror and smoothed the collar of my best flannel shirt, the dark blue one Diane had picked out at the Goodwill on High Street the year before she got sick. I looked like what I was, a man who had earned every crease on his face by standing in the rain when other men went home. But to my son, I was starting to realize I looked like a stain on the blueprint of the life he was trying to sell. I had driven 5 hours from Columbus, Ohio, through the rolling green hills of Kentucky, the late afternoon sun turning the horse farms into postcards. I did not have the heart to appreciate. The cab smelled of old leather, diesel exhaust, and the faint ghost of Diane's lavender hand cream that I swore still lingered in the passenger seat 7 years after she left me. On that seat, wedged between my overnight bag and a thermos of gas station coffee, sat a battered steel toolbox. Scratched, dented, the red paint worn to bare metal at the corners from decades of job sites. Marcus had seen it 100 times growing up, and never once thought it was worth more than scrap. He called it my junk box the last time he visited. Over 3 years ago, he did not know what Diane had hidden inside it. Neither did I, until last week. But that discovery would wait. Right now, the phone in my pocket was still warm from the message that had just rearranged the architecture of my entire weekend. I pulled the device out and read the words one more time, letting each syllable land like a hammer strike on a cold chisel. "Your room is canceled. Sleep in the lobby. Do not embarrass me." No greeting. No dad. Just a clean, surgical dismissal, the kind of message you send to a contractor you have decided to terminate, not the father who paid your way through college with double shifts and frozen fingers on winter scaffolding. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. My own son. The boy whose first pair of steel-toed boots I had bought with overtime money. The teenager who had stood beside me, mixing mortar in the August heat at the old house on Sycamore Lane, had just thrown me away like construction debris. He was not hiding me from his wedding guests. He was erasing my presence from the most important weekend of his life, as if my existence were a code violation that needed correcting before the final inspection. Have you ever read a message from your own flesh and blood and felt the ground shift beneath you, not from shock, but from the sudden realization that the foundation you spent 37 years pouring was never meant to hold your weight? I looked up through the windshield at the Belmore Estate. White columns, wraparound porches, the kind of place that smelled like magnolia blossoms and bourbon, and the quiet certainty that people like me were meant to use the service entrance. Kentucky Derby decorations were everywhere. Red roses spilled from copper urns flanking the entrance. Bunting and racing silks draped from balconies. Valets in crisp white jackets hustled between German sedans and British sports cars with choreographed precision. I felt the weight of the toolbox beside me, solid and grounding. The way a good foundation feels when you press your palm flat against the slab and know it will hold. Diane always said this box held everything that mattered. I used to think she meant the wrenches and the voltage tester. Now I was beginning to understand she meant something else entirely. I reached for the silver watch on my left wrist, a heavy piece of engineering Diane had given me on our 40th anniversary. For decades, I had used its miniature recording device to dictate structural observations in the field when my hands were too frozen or too full of rope to write. I pressed the small recessed button on the side and felt the faint click of activation against my skin. I never enter a site without a record. That rule kept me honest for 43 years, and I was not about to break it now. The recording light pulsed once and held steady. Every sound from this moment forward would be etched into the digital memory of the only gift my wife had left me. I closed my eyes for a single breath and made a decision that would change everything. I was not going to sleep in the lobby. I was not going to drive back to Columbus like a ghost who had overstayed his welcome. I was going to walk through those front doors and find out exactly how deep the cracks in my son's foundation ran. I clicked the watch shut with a metallic snap that sounded like a nail gun firing into hardwood. That sound was a punctuation mark on the man who used to make excuses for Marcus Hollister. That man was gone. In his place was a foreman who had just received the most important inspection assignment of his life. I stepped out into the warm Kentucky evening, the smell of fresh-cut bluegrass and distant horse barns filling my lungs. The Belmore estate towered above me, gleaming and golden. To most people, it was a cathedral of luxury. To me, it was just a structure. And every structure, no matter how beautiful the paint job, has a weak point. I grabbed my overnight bag, leaving the toolbox on the passenger seat for now. It was not time for that yet. I straightened my flannel, squared my shoulders, and walked toward the golden light spilling from the main entrance. Behind me, my old Ford ticked as it cooled. Ahead of me, a black Tesla with custom plates hummed into the circular drive. Its electric engine, silent as a lie. The Tesla glided to a stop at the base of the limestone steps without a sound, as if even the car knew better than to announce itself with anything as common as noise. I stood beside my truck in the service lot, close enough to see the custom plates catch the last of the afternoon sun. MH1. Marcus Hollister. Number 1. He had always needed the world to know his rank, even on a license plate. The driver's door opened with a soft pneumatic hiss, and my son stepped onto the cobblestone like a man arriving at his own coronation. Marcus Hollister, 37 years old, 6 feet of tailored Italian wool and practiced confidence, moved through the golden light as if it had been designed specifically to frame him. His shoes were polished to a military shine. His jaw was set, at the angle of a man who believed that posture alone could substitute for substance. I watched him button his charcoal suit jacket with one hand, a gesture so smooth it looked rehearsed, and I thought about the boy who used to button his flannel wrong every single morning until he was 9. From the passenger side emerged Camille Duval, 32 years old, the only daughter of Philippe Duval, whose hospitality empire stretched across 14 states and whose name alone could open doors that most people did not even know existed. She was beautiful in the way that expensive buildings are beautiful. Every line calculated, every surface polished to reflect exactly the image the architect intended. Her cream-colored dress caught the breeze like a sail, and the smile she offered the approaching hotel manager was warm enough to melt glass. But I had spent my life measuring load-bearing walls, and I knew the difference between a structure that is strong and a structure that is merely decorated. The hotel manager, a tall man in a navy suit who looked like he had been assembled from the same catalog as the lobby furniture, rushed down the steps to greet them. The level of deference was staggering. Handshakes that lasted a beat too long. Laughter that carried no genuine joy. The bellhops moved around them like planets orbiting a private sun, reaching for bags before they were offered, opening doors before they were approached. Marcus placed his hand on the small of Camille's back, guiding her toward the private entrance of the east wing, and neither of them glanced toward the service lot where the common guests parked their common cars. Have you ever watched your own child walk past you, as if you were part of the landscaping? It is not anger that hits you first. It is a hollowness, a strange, ringing silence in the chest. like standing inside an empty building after the demolition crew has already pulled the wiring. I leaned against the hood of my truck, the warm metal pressing through my flannel, and I let my eyes follow Marcus up the limestone steps. That was when the late sun caught something on his collar, a small flash of silver, quick as a spark from a welder's torch, but unmistakable to a man who had memorized every piece of metal in his household the way an inspector memorizes every rivet in a bridge. It was a tie pin. Sterling silver, no larger than a finishing nail, shaped like a miniature carpenter's level with a single sapphire set where the bubble would be. I had held that pin in my palm the night Diane gave it to me. It was December 14th, the evening of my retirement dinner from the Ohio Department of Industrial Compliance. 43 years of crawling through scaffolding, condemning unsafe structures, and fighting city councils who wanted to cut corners on schools and hospitals, and my wife had marked the occasion with a piece of silver that fit in the crease of my hand. She had it engraved on the back. I could still feel the letters under my thumb if I closed my eyes. R.H. Build true. It was the most valuable thing I owned. Not because of the silver, but because of the woman who chose those words. 3 months after Diane passed, I had asked Marcus if he had seen the pin while sorting through the house. He looked me straight in the eye, standing in the kitchen where his mother used to hum gospel songs over the stove, and told me it must have been lost during the estate clearing. Probably thrown out with the junk, Dad. You know how those movers are. I believed him. I mourned that small piece of silver alongside her memory, never once imagining that my son had pocketed it like loose change from a dead woman's dresser. But there it was, catching the amber glow of a Kentucky sunset, pinned to the collar of a man who had rewritten his entire history to exclude the people who built it. I watched the silver flash disappear through the hotel's private entrance, and something shifted inside me. It was not the hot surge of rage I expected. It was something colder, something structural. The feeling I used to get when I would run my hand along a support beam and feel the invisible tremor that told me the concrete had already begun to separate from the rebar inside. The building still looked fine from the outside. The paint was fresh, the windows clean, but the skeleton was failing, and it was only a matter of time before the load found the fracture. Marcus was not just hiding me from his wedding. He was wearing my retirement on his collar and my dead wife's memory on his sleeve, parading through a world built on the back of a man he was trying to erase. The tie pin was not a fashion accessory. It was stolen honor, and he was displaying it like a trophy, in a case he had never earned the right to open. I thought about Diane in her hospital bed, her fingers too thin to close around my hand, whispering that Marcus would take care of things. I trust him, Ray. He is our boy. She had said it with the absolute certainty of a woman who believed that the walls her family built would stand forever. She did not know that the boy she trusted was already measuring the scrap value of her legacy before the mortar was dry. A foreman does not leave a site until the inspection is done, and I had not even started. I pushed off the hood of the truck, the warm metal releasing my back with a faint squeak, and I turned toward the main entrance. The golden light from the lobby spilled across the limestone steps like a welcome mat made of fire. The valets glanced at me, then quickly looked away, their eyes performing the same rapid calculation every doorman in America makes when a man in flannel approaches a building made of marble. I did not care. I had walked onto construction sites where the foreman before me had signed off on a structure that was 6 months from collapse. I had stood in front of city boards and told them their brand new school gymnasium would kill children if they did not reinforce the trusses. I had been laughed at, threatened, and ignored. And I had been right every single time. My boots hit the first marble step, and the sound rang out across the valet circle like a slow, deliberate drumbeat. Each step was a statement. I am here. I am not leaving. And the man inside this building, who thinks he can cancel my existence with a text message, is about to learn that you cannot condemn a man who has spent his entire life writing the inspection reports. The automatic glass doors of the Belmore estate hissed open like a pressure seal releasing. And the lobby hit me with the force of a world that was never designed to include men with calluses. The air inside was a thick cocktail of expensive white lilies, lemon floor wax, and the faint mineral tang of Italian marble that had been polished until it reflected the ceiling chandeliers like still water. My work boots left a thin trail of Kentucky road dust on the stone, and I did not care. I had tracked worse across inspection sites that cost more than this hotel, and the concrete never complained. The lobby was a cathedral of curated excess. Vaulted ceilings soared 3 stories overhead, supported by fluted columns that looked like they had been carved by men who charged by the flourish. Brass fixtures gleamed along every surface, and fresh flowers erupted from crystal vases the size of fire hydrants. Derby weekend had transformed the space into a temple of racing culture. Oversized prints of legendary thoroughbreds lined the walls, and a string quartet in the far corner played something classical that I could not name. But that sounded like money gently reminding itself how important it was. I moved through the crowd like a wrench dropped into a jewelry box. The guests milling around the lobby were a species I recognized but did not belong to. Women in silk cocktail dresses and men in seersucker suits that cost more than my truck payment glanced at me with that particular expression I had learned to read 40 years ago on construction sites. It was the look people give a crack in the plaster, not alarming enough to report, but noticeable enough to avoid. I walked straight to the reception desk, a slab of polished mahogany that stretched the length of a small bridge. My reflection in the brass siding looked exactly how I felt. A rough-edged smudge on a master painting, but my posture was straight. I had inspected the spines of buildings that housed governors and senators. I was not going to bend for a hotel clerk. The young man behind the counter wore a silver name tag that read Caleb. He had the kind of face that had not yet learned how to hide compassion behind professionalism, and his eyes performed a rapid, uncomfortable scan of my flannel shirt and worn jeans before snapping back to his screen. I did not wait for him to find his script. I leaned one calloused hand on the marble counter, the stone cool and unforgiving beneath my palm. "Check the name," I said, my voice low and steady. "Hollister. Raymond Hollister." His fingers danced across the keyboard, the frantic clicking the only sound in our small corner of the vast lobby. I watched his face change as the information loaded. The professional smile that hotels train into their staff like a uniform began to slip, replaced by something that looked uncomfortably close to pity. "Mr. Hollister, I am very sorry," Caleb whispered, his eyes darting toward a senior manager near the elevators, before returning to me. "The guest who booked the wedding block, Mr. Marcus Hollister, canceled this specific reservation personally at 6:50 this evening." He paused, swallowing hard. He also noted that the guest associated with the room would not be attending the weekend's festivities. The words did not sting the way the text message had. They felt more like a confirmation of a demolition order. The betrayal was no longer just a digital ghost on my phone screen. It was a recorded action in a hotel ledger. A deliberate erasure executed with the same cold efficiency Marcus used to close his business deals. My son had not just canceled a room, he had filed paperwork to make me disappear. Let me ask you something. Have you ever felt the air leave a room just because you walked into it? That is the smell of money deciding you do not belong. Every bellhop, every guest lingering near the concierge, every pair of eyes that slid over my flannel and boots carried the silent assumption that I was a mistake that needed correction. But Marcus had forgotten one critical thing about his father. I do not just find cracks. I know how to use them. "Is the room availability subject to Mr. Hollister's approval?" I asked, letting my voice sharpen just enough to change the geometry of the conversation. "Or can any guest with a valid card book a vacancy?" Caleb blinked, confused by the shift in tone. "Well, sir, the hotel is nearly full due to Derby weekend and the wedding. But as of this moment, the Heritage Suite is the only remaining vacancy." He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "It is available, sir, but it is $3,900 per night." He said the number the way a doctor delivers a terminal diagnosis, slow and careful, expecting me to flinch. His eyes lingered on my worn clothes, calculating the distance between my appearance and the price tag he had just placed between us. Marcus had spent the last decade assuming I was a penniless retiree, surviving on a modest state pension and whatever scraps of dignity I could still afford. He did not know that for the past 7 years I had been quietly building a private consulting practice, hired by insurance companies and state agencies to assess structural failures in the aftermath of construction disasters across 4 states. It was messy, high-stakes work, the kind of work that corporations pay handsomely for to avoid the courtroom. I had never told Marcus. I had wanted to surprise him, to build a safety net beneath his ambitions. But now that net was about to become something else entirely. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a black metal credit card, the kind issued to my private consulting firm, Hollister Structural Associates. The card was heavier than it looked, and when I slid it across the marble counter, the sound it made was a clean, decisive click that silenced every assumption Caleb had been making since I walked through the door. His eyes widened as he registered the weight and color of the metal. "I will take the Heritage Suite for the duration of the weekend," I said. "And I expect full guest privileges, including access to all public event spaces." The card chipped. A green light. Acceptance. Caleb began processing the payment with a speed that bordered on reverence, his fingers suddenly treating the keyboard with the care of a man handling something far above his pay grade. But as he reached the final confirmation screen, his expression shifted. The professional mask did not just slip, it fractured. He leaned across the counter, his voice dropping to a whisper that smelled of coffee and peppermint. "Mr. Hollister, I need to tell you something. There is a flag on your name in our internal guest management system." A knot formed in my stomach, tight and cold. "What kind of flag?" He tapped a few keys, his face genuinely troubled. "It is a security advisory, sir. It designates you as a potential disruption risk at all Duval-affiliated events this weekend. It recommends that front desk staff alert the security team if you attempt to access the ballroom, the private gardens, or the East Wing." I stood perfectly still, the dry taste of hotel air suddenly metallic on my tongue. Someone had placed a target on my back before I had even turned the key in my ignition. But Caleb's next words rearranged everything I thought I understood about the architecture of this trap. "Sir, this advisory was not filed by Marcus Hollister." He glanced over his shoulder, then back at me. "It was authorized by the office of Philippe Duval." The father of the bride was watching me, and he had started watching before I even left Columbus. The name Philippe Duval hung in the air between us like the smell of smoke before you find the fire. I stared at Caleb, the young clerk's face a battlefield of professional obligation and genuine concern, and I felt the geometry of my situation shift like a slab settling on a cracked footing. Marcus. I understood. Marcus was my son, my failure, my blind spot. But Philippe Duval was a stranger, a billionaire hotelier whose empire spanned 14 states, and he had flagged my name in his security system before I had even packed my bag. "How long has this advisory been active?" I asked, keeping my voice level. Caleb checked the timestamp. 3 days ago, sir. Wednesday afternoon. 3 days. I was still replacing brake pads on my truck on Wednesday, debating whether the 5-hour drive was worth making for a son who had not returned my last 4 phone calls. Someone in Duval's office had decided I was a threat before I had even decided I was coming. Caleb opened his mouth to say more, but before the words could form, a hand appeared on his shoulder. I looked up and saw a man in a dark hotel management blazer step behind the counter. He was around 42, broad-shouldered, with deep brown skin and a close-cropped beard showing threads of silver. His name tag read, Elijah Moss, Guest Services Director, but his eyes told a different story than his title. He looked at me, and recognition flooded his face like water filling a foundation trench. The professional mask cracked wide open, replaced by something raw and old that smelled like wet concrete and rust, and the memory of a day neither of us had ever been able to forget. "Mr. Hollister," he said, and his voice carried a weight that had nothing to do with hotel protocol. I knew that voice. I knew the scar along the left side of his jaw, disappearing beneath his collar, like a river going underground. 15 years ago, that scar was fresh and bleeding, and the man wearing it was 27 years old, pinned beneath a collapsed scaffolding frame at the Lincoln Heights Elementary School renovation in Columbus. I was the foreman on that job. I heard the groan of the steel 3 seconds before the bolts sheared, the one who screamed for everyone to clear the north wall. Most of the crew made it. Elijah did not. I found him under 400 pounds of twisted aluminum and splintered plank, his face a mask of blood and concrete dust. The fire department was 11 minutes away. I did not have 11 minutes. I used a hydraulic jack from my truck and a salvaged I-beam to lever the scaffolding off his chest, while 2 apprentices held the frame steady. The paramedics told me later that if I had waited for the official rescue team, the compression would have stopped his breathing within 6 minutes. I had not seen Elijah since the day he was loaded into the ambulance, his hand gripping mine with a strength that did not match his broken body. He had whispered something through the blood in his mouth that I carried for 15 years. "I owe you the walls I build, Mr. Hollister." Now he was standing in front of me in a hotel blazer, and the walls he had built were different from anything I had imagined. But the debt in his eyes had not changed. It had only compounded. "Caleb, I will handle Mr. Hollister's check-in personally," Elijah said, his tone shifting back to professional, with a smoothness that told me he had learned to navigate luxury the way I navigated scaffolding. By knowing which beams to trust, he picked up my overnight bag before I could protest. A gesture that felt less like service and more like allegiance. He led me past the string quartet and crystal vases, toward a narrow corridor hidden behind a silk partition near the service elevators. The transition was immediate. One moment I was standing in a cathedral of polished brass. The next I was in a concrete service hallway that smelled of industrial cleaner, laundry starch, and the honest sweat of people who kept this palace running while guests pretended it maintained itself. Elijah pressed the call button for the staff elevator and turned to face me. The hotel persona fell away completely. "Mr. Hollister, something is wrong with this wedding." His voice was low and urgent, stripped of every polished syllable. "I have been managing the event logistics for 3 months, and the numbers do not add up. The Duval family is running a parallel operation inside this hotel that has nothing to do with flower arrangements." The elevator arrived with a tired groan. We stepped inside, and he pressed the top floor button. "What kind of parallel operation?" I asked, watching his reflection in the brushed metal doors. "I do not have proof yet. But your son's deposit for the venue rental was flagged by our accounting department twice. The payment came from a company that does not exist outside a P.O. box in Wilmington, Delaware. And the Duval security team has been running background checks on wedding guests that go far beyond standard protocol." He paused, his jaw tightening. "They pulled your military service record, your pension statements, even your property tax history from Franklin County." The elevator shuddered to a stop. The doors opened onto a hushed corridor of ivory carpet and oak paneling, the kind of silence that only extreme wealth can afford. Elijah handed me the gold keycard, and as our hands met over the plastic, I felt the faintest tremor in his grip. "Be careful in this building, Mr. Hollister," he said, his eyes holding mine across 15 years and a collapsed scaffold. "The foundation is not what it looks like." I took the key and walked the corridor alone. The carpet swallowed my boots, a plush silence that felt less like luxury and more like insulation against the truth. I pushed open the massive oak doors at the end of the hall. The Heritage Suite was a monument to excess. Crystal chandeliers, silk furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking estate gardens, where white tents were being erected for tomorrow's ceremony. The air was thick with the cloying scent of white lilies in crystal vases on every surface. This single room cost more per night than Diane and I spent on our first year of mortgage payments on Sycamore Lane. I dropped my bag on a silk chair, a deliberate smudge on the perfection. Then I saw it. On the mahogany desk across the room, The telephone console sat in shadow, and a small red light blinked with the steady rhythm of a heartbeat that did not belong to anything alive. A voicemail was waiting. And I knew, before I pressed play, that the voice on the other end would not belong to my son. It would belong to the stranger who had replaced him. I sat down at the mahogany desk, the leather chair groaning under me like an old joint settling into place. The red light on the telephone console pulsed in the dim corner of the suite, a small digital heartbeat that seemed to quicken as my finger hovered over the play button. The white lilies on the desk filled my nostrils with their funereal sweetness, and for a moment I was back in the viewing room at the Holcomb Brothers Funeral Home on Broad Street, standing over Diane's casket while those same flowers choked the air around me. I pressed play. The voice that filled the Heritage Suite did not belong to the boy who used to ride on my shoulders at the Franklin County Fair, laughing so hard his whole body shook against my neck. It did not belong to the teenager who helped me pour the foundation for the garden shed on Sycamore Lane, his hands too small for the trowel, but his determination bigger than the concrete. The voice that came through that speaker was polished, venomous, and utterly unrecognizable. It was the voice of a man who had practiced cruelty until it sounded like concern. "I know you are there, Dad." The recording began, the word Dad landing like a stone dropped into still water. "I saw the alert the second you checked in. Do not be a fool. This weekend is not about you. It has never been about you." I sat perfectly still as Marcus instructed me to remain inside this expensive cage. He spoke in the measured cadence of a man reading terms and conditions, each sentence designed to close a door rather than open one. He told me that the Duval family's security team had been briefed on my condition, a condition I did not know I had. He said the words cognitive episodes as casually as a man might mention the weather, and the clinical precision of the phrase told me it had been rehearsed. "If you try to play the martyr at my wedding," his voice continued, the speaker distorting slightly on the consonants, "I will make sure everyone in that ballroom believes you have finally lost your mind. The paperwork is already filed. Dr. Ashwin Patel has submitted a preliminary evaluation based on family testimony, and the conservatorship hearing is scheduled for Monday morning at the Jefferson County Courthouse." The voicemail ended. The red light stopped blinking. The silence that followed was worse than anything he had said, because silence is the sound a building makes after the last support beam has been removed and the structure is deciding whether to stand or fall. I stared at the phone console, the taste of dry, recycled hotel air bitter on my tongue. A conservatorship. My son was not just trying to hide me for a weekend to protect a business deal or spare himself the embarrassment of a father in flannel. He was planning to legally seize my autonomy. He was going to walk into a courthouse on Monday morning with a doctor I had never met and testimony I had never given, and ask a judge to declare Raymond Hollister mentally incompetent. He wanted the legal right to decide where I lived, what I ate, who I spoke to, and whether I was allowed to leave the building. He wanted to turn the last chapter of my life into a locked room with his name on the door. Have you ever heard your own son's voice and realized you were listening to a stranger who happened to share your blood? It is not the anger that destroys you. It is the arithmetic. You start counting the years you spent building something you believed was permanent, and you realize every beam was hollow, every joint was dry-fitted, and the man you trusted to carry the structure forward was selling the lumber before the roof was on. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the silver watch. The recording indicator glowed faint against the casing. Every word Marcus had just spoken through that hotel phone was already etched into the digital memory Diane had given me. He did not know it, but his threats were now evidence, and evidence has a way of outliving the men who create it. My mind drifted back to the last winter of Diane's life, when the world had shrunk to the size of a hospital room and the beeping of monitors was the only music left. I remembered sitting beside her bed at Mount Carmel East, holding her hand while the machines breathed for her. She was lucid that afternoon, one of the last clear days before the morphine pulled her under for good. Her fingers, thin as bird bones, had tightened around mine with a strength that startled me. "Marcus will take care of things, Ray," she had whispered, her voice a thread of sound against the mechanical hum of the IV pump. "I trust him. He is our boy." I had nodded. unable to speak past the concrete block lodged in my throat. I had believed her, because I needed to believe her, because the alternative was too heavy for a man who was already carrying the weight of watching his wife disappear one breath at a time. I had handed my son the keys to our life that night. The bank accounts, the insurance contacts, the estate paperwork, all of it, so I could spend every remaining hour at Diane's side, instead of in an office sorting documents. "I trust you, son," I had whispered in that sterile hallway while the fluorescent lights hummed like a hymn played in the wrong key. "You are all I have left." 7 years later, sitting in a suite that cost more than our first car, I understood the full weight of that trust. It was not a gift I had given Marcus. It was a weapon I had handed to a man who was already measuring the distance between my signature and his ambition. Every form I signed, every account I authorized, every quiet evening I spent watering Diane's dogwood tree instead of auditing my son's business had been a brick in the wall Marcus was building around me, and now he was ready to seal the top. The thought should have broken me. A year ago it might have, but I had spent the last week staring at the contents of a battered steel toolbox, and what I found inside had replaced my grief with something far more dangerous than sadness. It was clarity. The kind of clarity a foreman feels when he finally locates the fracture line that explains why the whole building is leaning. Then I heard it. A knock at the door. Not the heavy, official strike of hotel security or the confident rap of a man who owned the hallway. This was a light, rapid pattern. 3 quick taps, a pause, 2 more. It was the knock of someone who knew the blind spots of the corridor cameras and had timed their approach to avoid the security rotation. I moved to the foyer, my boots silent on the thick carpet. I did not ask who it was. I pulled the heavy oak door open just enough to see a young woman in an oversized hotel staff jacket, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fierce determination that reminded me so much of her mother that my chest physically ached. Sophie Wren, 26 years old. My niece, Lorraine's daughter. And the last person Marcus expected to find inside this building. She did not wait for an invitation. She slipped through the gap like smoke through a crack in a wall, a laptop bag pressed against her ribs, and the door clicked shut behind her with the soft finality of a trap closing in the right direction. Sophie moved through the heritage suite with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent months learning how to be invisible. She checked the bedroom wing, ran her fingers along the crown, molding near the light fixtures, and held a small handheld device near the smoke detector above the desk before she said a single word. The blue glow of the device's screen reflected off her glasses as she worked, casting her face in the same cold light I used to see on the monitors of structural analysis equipment. "Elijah disabled the internal mic in this suite 20 minutes ago," she said, clicking the device shut. "But we should assume the hallway cameras are still active, and Marcus has at least one person watching the security feed." She set her laptop on the marble coffee table and opened it with the practiced speed of someone who had rehearsed this moment. The screen bloomed to life, filling the dim room with a harsh blue glare that made the white lilies look like they were made of ice. I sat across from her on the silk sofa, the expensive fabric feeling like a lie against my work clothes, and I studied the face of my niece, Sophie Wren, 26 years old. The last time I had seen her, she was 19, standing at her mother's graveside in a black dress that was too big for her, holding a single white carnation so tightly the stem snapped in her fist. Lorraine's girl. She had her mother's jaw and her mother's stubbornness. But behind her glasses were eyes that belonged to a woman who had spent 7 years converting grief into data. "I have been investigating Marcus for 8 months, Uncle Ray." Her voice was steady, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers hovered over the keyboard, like a surgeon preparing for the first incision. "I work in cybersecurity forensics at a firm in Cincinnati. 6 months after Mom died, I started running financial audits on every company connected to Marcus's name. What I found is not a business. It is an excavation site. He has been mining our family for raw material." She turned the laptop toward me, and the first document filled the screen. It was a power of attorney form, dated 14 months ago, bearing my full legal name and a signature at the bottom that made my blood slow to a crawl. This is the document Marcus used to authorize the sale of your house on Sycamore Lane to a holding company called Duval Holdings, LLC. Sophie explained, zooming in on the signature line. The sale price was $228,000. The independent market assessment values that property at $380,000. He sold your home, the home where you raised him, for 40% below market value. I leaned forward, my calloused fingers hovering over the screen. The signature was nearly perfect. The slant of the R, the loop on the H, the slight forward lean of the Y in Raymond. It was the way I had signed my name on 43 years of state inspection reports, and someone had studied those reports with the patience of a man dismantling a clock. I never signed this, Sophie. My voice came out as gravel scraping against stone. I have never seen this document in my life. I know, she said softly. The notary stamp belongs to a man named Victor Payne, who also happens to be the legal counsel for Marcus's development company. He notarized his own client's forgery. The room felt like it was contracting, the silk walls pressing inward as the scope of the fraud began to take shape. My house on Sycamore Lane was not just a property. It was the house Diane and I bought with a loan we paid off over 29 years. It was the kitchen where she hummed gospel over the stove every Sunday morning. It was the garden where I planted the white dogwood tree, the spring after she passed, pressing the sapling into the soil with the same hands that had lowered her casket. Marcus had sold it like surplus material from a job site. Why Duval Holdings? I asked, though the answer was already forming in my gut, like the slow recognition of a crack spreading through a load-bearing wall. Because Marcus needed the Duval family to believe he came from generational wealth. He used the below-market sale as a financial concession to sweeten a $14 million partnership deal with Philippe Duval's hospitality group. He told them the family estate was being contributed to the joint venture as a gesture of good faith. She paused. He donated your life's work as a business card. Have you ever watched someone disassemble the house you built with your bare hands and realize they are using the bricks to build a monument to themselves? That is the arithmetic of betrayal. Every nail you drove, every mortgage payment you scraped together, becomes a line item in someone else's ledger. But Sophie was not finished. She clicked to a second folder, and the screen filled with a document that made the air leave my lungs in a single, involuntary rush. It was a change of beneficiary form for Diane's life insurance policy from Great Lakes Mutual. The policy was worth $450,000, taken out when we were newlyweds. The premiums paid with overtime shifts and weekend inspection jobs for 38 years. The original beneficiary was you, Uncle Ray, Sophie said, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. But this form, filed 11 days before Aunt Diane passed, redirects the entire death benefit to an entity called the Hollister Legacy Group. It is a shell company registered in Marcus's name. I stared at the signature line. Diane M. Hollister. The letters were smooth, flowing, confident. They looked like my wife's handwriting the way a photograph looks like a living person. Close enough to fool a stranger. Close enough to pass a glance. But wrong in ways that only a man who had watched that hand write grocery lists and birthday cards and love notes for 42 years would ever notice. The ink pressure is too even, I whispered, my throat tightening. Diane's hand shook during chemo. She could barely hold a spoon by the end. She could not have written her name like this. Not 11 days before she died. Sophie nodded, her eyes glistening behind her glasses. The digital submission was filed from Marcus's office IP address at 3:17 in the morning. He forged her signature while she was sleeping in a hospital bed. The silence in the suite was absolute. The muffled bass of the rehearsal dinner downstairs had stopped. Or maybe I had simply stopped hearing it. My son had not waited for his mother to die. He had reached into her final days and stolen the one thing she had set aside to keep me safe. He had forged her hand while the morphine kept her eyes closed, and he had used the money to build the pedestal he was now standing on. I closed my eyes, feeling the cold weight of the marble table under my palms, And I heard Diane's voice again. I trust him, Ray. He is our boy. When I opened my eyes, Sophie was watching me with an expression that held no pity. Only a shared understanding of the kind of damage that does not show on the surface but compromises everything underneath. She reached for the trackpad and opened a third folder. Her face went pale, the blue light draining the color from her skin, until she looked like a ghost sitting across from me in this overpriced tomb. There is more, Uncle Ray. Her voice cracked for the first time. This one is about my mother. Sophie did not click the file open immediately. Her hand rested on the trackpad, the way a demolition engineer's hand rests on the detonator, steady on the surface, but carrying the full weight of what comes next. The blue light of the laptop turned her face into sharp angles and deep shadows, and I saw something in her eyes that I recognized from my own mirror. The look of someone who has been carrying a load for so long that putting it down feels more terrifying than holding it. My mother trusted Marcus the way Aunt Diane trusted him, Sophie began. Her voice controlled but thin, like a wire stretched to the point just before it sings. He had a gift for making people believe that loving him and funding him were the same thing. She opened the folder. The first document was a private investment agreement dated 4 years ago, printed on letterhead that read, Hollister Estates Development Group. Below the company name was a tagline that made my stomach clench. Built on a legacy of structural excellence. My name. My 43 years of inspecting schools and hospitals, distilled into a marketing slogan for a company I had never heard of. Marcus told my mother he was launching a residential development in the short North District of Columbus, Sophie continued. He said you had personally reviewed the structural plans and endorsed the project. He said it was a family venture to honor Aunt Diane's memory. The air in the suite grew thin. Lorraine, my younger sister, the girl who followed me around construction sites wearing my old hard hat 3 sizes too big, asking what every tool did until the crew called her Little Foreman. She became a school librarian in Westerville. A woman who believed the right book could rebuild a person from the inside. She never made much money, but she saved with the discipline of someone who understood that security was a foundation, not a luxury. How much? I asked, though the number was already forming like a fracture line spreading through concrete. $130,000. Every dollar of her retirement savings. 31 years of contributions from a public school salary. The number hit me like a dropped beam. Lorraine had accumulated that fund 1 paycheck at a time, skipping vacations, driving the same Honda for 14 years, eating lunch at her desk instead of going out. It was the physical evidence of a life lived with care, placed like bricks in a wall meant to protect her when she could no longer protect herself. The project never broke ground, Sophie said. Hollister Estates dissolved 6 months after the investment closed. The money was funneled through 2 accounts before landing in Marcus's personal fund. He used it to lease the office space and the German car that impressed the Duval family enough to get the first meeting. Marcus had turned my sister's life savings into a costume and walked into a room full of billionaires pretending to be one of them. The passport that got him through the door was my name. Have you ever been used as the reason someone you loved made the worst decision of their life, without knowing your name was on the contract? Lorraine believed Marcus because he was my son. She trusted the investment because she trusted me. And Marcus weaponized that trust with the precision of a man who understood exactly which relationships to exploit. He did not just steal her money. He stole her faith in her own brother. She stopped calling you, Sophie said. She was too ashamed to admit what happened and too heartbroken to pretend everything was fine. The depression came that winter. By spring, she stopped eating regular meals. The school put her on medical leave in September. I knew the rest. The phone call from Westerville General at 6:14 on a Tuesday morning. Lorraine Wren, 58, cardiac arrest, found unresponsive by a neighbor who noticed uncollected mail. I drove to the hospital in a fog so thick I do not remember crossing the county line. They had already pulled the sheet over her face. 18 months. The distance between Marcus's handshake and my sister's coffin. $130,000 in 18 months of silence. and a heart that broke under a weight it was never engineered to carry. Sophie reached into her laptop bag and pulled out a single envelope, yellowed at the edges, unsealed. She placed it on the marble table with the care of someone handling evidence that is also a piece of a person. I found this in her desk after she died. It was never mailed. I picked it up. The paper was soft and worn, held many times, debated over. Inside was a sheet of lined notebook paper, the kind Lorraine used for reading lists. Her handwriting was shaky but legible, the letters leaning forward as if reaching for me through the page. Dear Ray, I am writing this because I cannot say it out loud. Marcus told me, you approved the investment yourself. He said it was your idea, that you wanted the family to build something together after Diane. I believed him because he is your son, and because I have always believed in you more than I believed in myself. I am sorry I did not call to confirm. I was afraid you would think I did not trust you. Now the money is gone and I do not know how to look at you without seeing the lie I let myself believe. I miss you, Ray. I miss Diane. I miss believing that the walls we built were strong enough to hold. The letter was unsigned. She had not finished it. Or maybe she decided the only honest ending was the one that arrived 18 months later in a hospital room she never walked out of. I set the paper on the marble. My hands, the hands that had poured concrete and pulled men from wreckage and held my wife through her last breath, were trembling for the first time in 70 years. He used my name to kill my sister. Sophie. She placed her hand over mine. Her grip was strong, her fingers calloused in different places but carrying the same inheritance of loss. We sat in the blue light. Two people connected by a man who had turned their family into raw material. Then I heard it. Paper against stone. The faint hiss of something sliding across the marble floor beneath the oak door, coming to rest against the brass threshold, like a warning delivered too late. A white envelope sat beneath the door like a blade slipped under the skin of the room while we were not looking. Neither of us moved. The envelope sat on the marble floor like a white scar on dark skin, its edges crisp and clinical against the warm stone. Sophie was already on her feet, moving toward the door with the silent precision of someone whose professional life depended on knowing where the cameras were pointing. She pressed her eye to the brass peephole and held her breath for a count that felt longer than any inspection I had ever performed on a suspect beam. Empty, she whispered, stepping back. Whoever left this knows the blind spots of the hallway cameras better than the staff does. They did not walk up and slide it under. They appeared and vanished like they were never there. I bent down and picked up the envelope. The paper was heavy, the kind of bond stock used for legal correspondence, and it carried no name, no return address, just a faint antiseptic smell, sharp and clinical, like rubbing alcohol mixed with the sterile tang of a doctor's waiting room. The scent alone told me this document had not come from the hotel's front desk. It had come from somewhere that dealt in diagnoses rather than reservations. I tore the seal, and a stack of printed pages spilled onto the marble coffee table. Sophie moved beside me, her laptop still open. Its blue glow mixing with the warm light of the desk lamp as we leaned over the papers together. The first page hit me with the force of a condemned notice nailed to a front door. Request for emergency conservatorship and involuntary psychiatric evaluation. In the matter of Raymond David Hollister, age 70, resident of Franklin County, Ohio. The petition was typed, formatted, and ready for a judge's signature. It cited a preliminary medical evaluation conducted by Dr. Ashwin Patel of the Duval Family Wellness Center, a facility I had never visited, staffed by a physician I had never met, located in a building I could not have found on a map. The evaluation described me in language so detached from reality that reading it felt like watching someone build a replica of your house and then set it on fire. Patient exhibits persistent cognitive decline consistent with early-onset vascular dementia. I read aloud, my voice flat as poured concrete, marked by obsessive fixation on deceased spouse, inability to process grief in a constructive manner, and repeated episodes of confusion regarding financial and legal matters. Patient poses a significant risk of self-harm through impaired judgment and requires immediate supervised care. Every word was a brick in a wall being built around me. A wall I could not see from the outside because it was made of medical terminology and professional letterhead. The kind of materials that judges trust because they come wrapped in the authority of a white coat. Sophie pulled the second section of the documents toward her. It was a printed email chain spanning 4 months. Correspondence between us, Camille, coordinating the construction of my supposed decline with the same methodical precision I used to document structural defects in a failing building. They had been cataloging my behavior since February, turning the ordinary rhythms of an aging father's life into clinical symptoms. Look at this entry from March, Sophie said, her finger tracing a highlighted paragraph. Phone call from RH at 7:42 p.m. Subject repeated questions about wedding date and venue location. Noted as evidence of short-term memory fragmentation. I remembered that call. I had phoned Marcus to confirm the wedding details because he had not sent me an invitation. I asked twice because he gave me 2 different answers. Not because I could not remember the first one. The April entries were worse. Subject mentioned deceased wife Diane 4 times during a 12-minute conversation. Demonstrates inability to separate past from present. Recommend evaluation for grief-related psychosis. I had called to tell him that the dogwood tree Diane planted was blooming for the first time in 3 years. I thought he might want to know that something his mother had touched was still alive. He had logged it as evidence of my failing mind. Have you ever realized that the phone calls you made out of love were being recorded as proof that you were losing your grip on reality? Every time I reached out to my son, he was building a case. Every time I said Diane's name, he was adding a symptom to a diagnosis that existed only in the imagination of a doctor who had never looked me in the eye. The final page of the email chain contained Camille's summary, written with the clinical detachment of a woman drafting a business proposal rather than destroying a human life. Timeline confirmed. Petition filing Monday, 9 a.m. Jefferson County. Patel's evaluation submitted electronically. RH will be under hotel observation through the weekend per Pruitt's team. No direct contact recommended to avoid triggering a lucid objection before the hearing. No direct contact. They were not just building a case against my sanity. They were quarantining me from anyone who might witness that I was perfectly sound. The hotel was not a venue for a wedding. It was a holding facility, and Derek Pruitt's security team were the orderlies. Sophie turned to the last item in the envelope. It was not printed. It was handwritten on a small piece of cream-colored cardstock, the kind used for place settings at formal events. The script was elegant, precise, with sharp loops and careful crossings that suggested someone trained in calligraphy or event design. 5 words, written in ink that looked almost black under the lamplight. They are signing at 10 a.m. in the Magnolia Room. You have until then. I stared at the handwriting, turning it under the light. It did not match Marcus. It did not match Camille. Sophie pulled up the hotel's wedding coordination file on her laptop, scrolling until she found a scanned copy of the seating chart submitted by the lead wedding planner. The penmanship was identical. Someone on the inside is helping you, Uncle Ray, Sophie said, her voice barely above a breath. Someone who has access to the Magnolia Room schedule and the legal documents, and who decided that you deserve to know the countdown. 10 a.m. The Magnolia Room. That gave me less than 14 hours before my son walked into a conference room with a forged medical evaluation and a cooperative judge and signed away my right to speak, to choose, to exist as a free man. Less than 14 hours before the walls closed permanently and the man they had built on paper replaced the man standing in this room. I looked at the clock on the suite's mantelpiece. The brass hands moved with the same indifferent precision as every clock on every construction site I had ever worked. Time does not care who you are or what you have lost. It only cares about the deadline. Then the door shook. Not the whisper of a sliding envelope or the coded tapping of an ally. This was a heavy, rhythmic, official knock that vibrated through the oak and rattled the brass chain lock. 3 strikes, evenly spaced, delivered with the mechanical patience of a man who knew the door would open because he had the authority to make it open. Sophie's eyes went wide. She grabbed her laptop and disappeared into the bedroom wing without a sound. pulling the door shut behind her with a click so faint it could have been a thought. I looked at the conservatorship papers spread across the table, then at the oak door, still shuddering from the impact. There was no time to hide the evidence. There was only time to decide which version of Raymond Hollister would answer the door. I swept the conservatorship papers into a stack and slid them beneath a copy of the hotel's leather-bound guest directory on the coffee table. The motion was instinctive, the same reflex I used on job sites when an OSHA inspector arrived unannounced and the scaffolding was not yet up to code. You do not hide the problem. You cover it long enough to control the conversation. I walked to the door and pulled it open. Derek Pruitt filled the doorway the way a load-bearing column fills a blueprint, square and immovable, and designed to make everything around it feel smaller. He was 45, broad through the shoulders, with a shaved head and a jaw that looked like it had been poured from the same mold as the hotel's concrete foundation. His hotel security uniform was pressed to a razor crease, and his utility belt carried enough equipment to manage a small riot. But it was the small green light glowing on the center of his chest that caught my attention first. His body camera was active. Its lens pointed directly at my face, recording every twitch of my expression and transmitting it to whoever was watching on the other end of the feed. "Mr. Hollister," Pruitt said, his voice carrying the practiced gentleness of a man who had been briefed on exactly how fragile I was supposed to be. "I apologize for the late hour. The hotel received a concerned family report regarding your well-being, and I wanted to check in personally." He did not wait for an invitation. He stepped into the foyer with the unhurried confidence of a man who understood that his badge was his warrant, his boots silent on the marble as he scanned the suite with eyes that catalogued everything and revealed nothing. "Do you know what day it is, sir?" he asked, his gaze pausing on the guest directory covering the papers before moving to the windows. "It is Friday evening," I replied, keeping my voice as level as a spirit gauge on a horizontal beam. "The 23rd of May. I am in the Heritage Suite of the Belmore Estate Hotel in Louisville, Kentucky. I drove here from Columbus, Ohio to attend my son's wedding tomorrow afternoon. Would you like my social security number as well? Or is my sanity sufficiently demonstrated?" The question landed harder than I intended, and I watched Pruitt's professional mask flicker. He was not accustomed to patients who diagnosed the test before the thermometer was out of the case. He adjusted his belt, the leather creaking softly, and changed his approach with the smooth pivot of a man trained in de-escalation. "Your son Marcus expressed deep concern about some recent episodes you have been having, sir," he continued, his voice dropping to the register people use when speaking to children and the elderly, "particularly regarding your late wife. He mentioned that the grief has been affecting your clarity." The mention of Diane in this man's mouth felt like gravel being poured into a clean foundation form. He did not know her name an hour ago. He was reading from a script Marcus had written, performing concern the way an actor performs lines, and the body camera on his chest was capturing my reaction for an audience I could not see. "My wife passed 7 years ago," I said, meeting his eyes without blinking. "I grieve her every day, and I remember every detail of the life we built together. That is not confusion, officer. That is love. And the fact that my son cannot tell the difference is his problem, not mine." Pruitt studied me for a moment, and I saw something shift behind his eyes. A crack in the certainty, a hairline fracture in the narrative he had been sold. But he was paid to deliver a product, not to question the engineering, and the crack sealed itself as quickly as it appeared. He spent another 5 minutes in the suite, his presence a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against the walls like humidity before a storm. He asked about my truck, my house in Columbus, my plans for the wedding. Each question was designed to trip a wire, to catch a contradiction that could be logged as evidence of the decline they had manufactured on paper. I answered every one with the precision of a man who had spent 43 years testifying before safety boards and construction tribunals. "Let me tell you something about wellness checks. They are the favorite tool of people who want to control you without looking like the villain. They do not want to help you. They want to document you in a way that makes your perspective irrelevant." Pruitt moved toward the door, pausing in the foyer to deliver his parting line with the practiced finality of a man closing a file. I suggest you stay in the suite for the rest of the evening, Mr. Hollister. Get some rest. We want to make sure tomorrow is a good day for your family." The door clicked shut. The lock engaged. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, as if the room had absorbed his presence and was now exhaling it slowly through the ventilation system. Sophie emerged from the bedroom wing within seconds, her face tight with controlled fury. "His body cam was streaming the entire time," she said, pulling up a network monitoring application on her laptop. The feed was routed to a private IP address registered to a device on the hotel's 4th floor. "Marcus was watching you in real time, waiting for you to crack." "He is going to keep waiting," I said, unbuttoning my flannel cuff to check the silver watch. The recording indicator pulsed steady. Every patronizing question, every scripted phrase Pruitt had delivered, was now stored alongside the voicemail and the evidence Sophie had brought. The digital file was growing, and Marcus did not know it existed. Sophie sat down at the coffee table, her fingers moving across her keyboard with renewed urgency. Then she stopped. She reached across the table and picked up my overnight bag, turning it slowly in her hands. Her fingers found something along the bottom seam, a slight bump beneath the canvas lining that did not match the contour of the bag's construction. She pulled a small black plastic tab from the stitching and held it under the desk lamp. It was a GPS tracking device, no larger than a thumbnail, commercial grade, the kind used for fleet management and high-value cargo shipments. "He has been tracking you since Columbus," Sophie said, her voice flat with a disgust that needed no volume to cut. "He knew every stop you made on the highway, every gas station, every rest area. He was mapping your route before you even crossed the Kentucky state line." I looked at the tracker, the small black rectangle sitting in Sophie's palm like a dead insect. My son had planted a surveillance device in my personal belongings, monitoring my movements with the same cold efficiency a shipping company uses to track a container of expendable goods. I did not tell Sophie to destroy it. I told her to put it back exactly where she found it. If Marcus wanted to watch me, I would give him something worth watching. Then my phone erupted. The screen lit up like a fire alarm, flashing red with a cascade of banking notifications that made the quiet suite feel like the control room of a collapsing structure. I looked down and felt the blood leave my face. The screen of my phone was a hemorrhage of red text and falling numbers, a digital bleed that I could not stop with pressure or prayer. Each notification arrived with a sharp vibration against my palm, and each one carried a piece of my life away like debris in a flood current. Transfer authorized. $40,000. Hollister Structural Associates operating account. Destination: Duval Capital Partners, LLC. I watched the number disappear from my balance the way I had watched concrete crack during a stress test, the fracture spreading faster than the eye could track, the structure losing integrity in real time while the men who built it stood around pretending the paint was still holding. Transfer authorized. $25,000. Hollister Personal Savings. Destination: a routing number I did not recognize, attached to an institution registered in Wilmington, Delaware, the same state where Marcus's ghost company kept its mailbox. The same phantom address Sophie had traced earlier that evening. He was not just stealing from me. He was feeding my money into the same machine that had already consumed Lorraine's retirement and Diane's insurance. A machine that existed only on paper but had very real teeth. Transfer authorized. $15,000. Emergency reserve account. Destination: Duval Holdings, LLC, Louisville, Kentucky. Sophie grabbed the phone from my hand, her fingers flying across the glass with the speed of someone who spoke fluent code. She pulled up the transfer logs, her eyes scanning the metadata the way I used to scan blueprints for load path errors. But the damage was cascading through my accounts faster than she could trace it. Each transaction triggering the next like a chain of dominoes falling through a building that had already lost its central column. "He is using a scripted transfer protocol, Uncle Ray," she said, her jaw tight enough to crack. "Automated batch commands routed through the forged power of attorney. The bank's fraud detection will not flag it because the authorization documents look legitimate on their end. By the time they review the signatures manually, the accounts will be empty. I stood in the center of the Heritage Suite, watching the numbers on my phone screen plummet with the same helpless clarity I felt the first time I watched a condemned building actually fall. You can know the collapse is coming. You can have every measurement, every calculation, every warning sign cataloged in your report. But nothing prepares you for the sound it makes when the structure you believed in hits the ground. $80,000. Gone in less than 4 minutes. 7 years of private consulting work, of crawling through disaster sites in freezing rain and documenting failures that insurance companies wanted buried, evaporated into a network of shell accounts that led back to the man who was supposed to carry my legacy forward. Then the final notification arrived, and it was not from my bank. It was from the Franklin County Clerk of Courts. An automated email confirmation, formatted with the bland efficiency of a government system that processes human tragedy the same way it processes parking permits. Title transfer completed. Property at 4412 Sycamore Lane, Columbus, Ohio. Transferred to Duval Holdings, LLC. Recorded sale price, $380,000. I read the words 3 times. Each reading drove the meaning deeper, like a concrete anchor being set into bedrock. My house was gone. The house Diane and I bought with a loan we spent 29 years paying off. The kitchen where she hummed gospel every Sunday while the coffee percolated. The porch where I sat on summer evenings, listening to the crickets and the distant sound of trains on the Norfolk Southern line. The bedroom where I held her hand the last night she slept at home before the hospital became her permanent address. And the garden. The garden where I had planted a white dogwood tree the spring after Diane's funeral, pressing the sapling into soil that was still soft from the winter rain. I had knelt in the mud that morning in my work clothes, my knees sinking into the cold earth. And I had talked to her while I packed the dirt around the roots. I told her I would water it every day. I told her something of ours would keep growing even after she was gone. For 7 years. That tree was the first thing I saw every morning, and the last thing I checked every night. It had bloomed 3 times. Each time the white petals opened, I felt her hand on my shoulder. He sold the garden where I planted Diane's dogwood, the only ground left where her roots were still alive. Have you ever lost a place that was not just a building but a body? A structure that held not just your furniture, but the physical memory of every person who had ever made it feel like something worth protecting. Losing a house is paperwork. Losing a home is an amputation. I looked at the timestamp on the email. The sale had been finalized at 6:50 in the evening. I felt the recognition hit me like a steel beam swinging loose on a crane. 6:50. The exact minute Caleb had told me Marcus personally canceled my hotel room at the front desk. It was not a coincidence. It was a coordinated demolition. While Marcus was downstairs erasing my reservation, his lawyers were upstairs filing the deed transfer. He had been signing away my home at the very moment he was ordering me to sleep in the lobby. A single tear traced a path through the deep lines of my face. It was involuntary. The kind of moisture that escapes not from sadness, but from the sheer atmospheric pressure of a betrayal so complete that even the body cannot hold it in. The tear tasted of salt and something metallic, like the rust water that seeps from old rebar when the concrete finally cracks open. Sophie watched me from across the table, her screen still glowing with the wreckage of my finances. She did not offer comfort. She understood, as I did, that comfort was not what this moment required. What it required was the thing that comes after grief, the cold structural clarity that allows a man to stop mourning the building and start reading the site for what comes next. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and looked across the suite to the corner where my battered steel toolbox sat on the silk-upholstered chair, its scratched red paint a smudge of honest labor against the pristine fabric. It had ridden beside me for 5 hours in the cab of my truck, unremarkable and overlooked, the way Marcus had always overlooked everything about my life that could not be converted into capital. Diane always said this box held everything that mattered. I had dismissed those words for years, the same way you dismiss the small settling sounds a house makes at night, assuming they are just the structure breathing. But Diane never said anything she did not mean. She was a woman who measured twice and labeled everything. And if she said the toolbox held what mattered, then the toolbox held what mattered. I looked at Sophie. She looked at the box. And for the first time that night, something shifted in the air. That was not fear or grief or rage. It was the feeling a foreman gets when he realizes the condemned building still has one room that is structurally sound, and the blueprints he needs are inside it. They say you can judge a man by his hands. Mine have poured foundations, pulled men from wreckage, and held my wife through her last breath. Tonight, at 2 a.m. in a suite that cost more than my first car, those hands were reaching for a battered steel toolbox that my dead wife had turned into a vault. I carried it to the marble coffee table. The red paint was scratched to bare metal at the corners, and the latches resisted my thumbs, the way old joints resist the cold. The lid opened with a groan of rusted hinges, and the smell hit me first. Machine oil, iron filings, old pine shavings, and beneath it all the faintest trace of lavender. Diane's hand cream, 7 years in a closed box, and the scent was still there, trapped in the wood grain like a message only I could read. The top tray held what you would expect: a voltage tester with a cracked housing, combination wrenches worn smooth, a tape measure I had carried since 1986. Vetters. Marcus had looked at this collection a dozen times and seen nothing but relics of a career he considered beneath him. He called it junk. Diane called it everything that mattered. I lifted the tray out. Below was the main compartment, lined with pine that had absorbed the lavender. I ran my fingers along the bottom, feeling for the seam I had discovered last week. My thumb caught a thin wooden panel that did not sit flush. I pressed one end, and the opposite side rose just enough to hook a fingernail underneath. The false bottom lifted away. Sophie leaned beside me, laptop light casting our shadows against the silk wallpaper. Beneath the panel was a space no deeper than a deck of cards, lined with Diane's lavender handkerchief folded into a neat square. She had prepared this compartment with the same care she brought to every part of our life. Measured twice, cut once, hidden where no one would look except the man whose hands earned the right to hold it. 3 items lay on the lavender cloth. The first was the original deed to our house on Sycamore Lane, unaltered, bearing both our signatures from 29 years ago. The second was the original beneficiary form for Diane's life insurance with Great Lakes Mutual, listing Raymond David Hollister as sole beneficiary, dated and notarized in her handwriting long before the cancer. These 2 documents proved every subsequent transfer was unauthorized. But it was the third item that changed everything. A USB drive, small and black, wrapped in another piece of lavender handkerchief. Diane had secured it with a rubber band and written 3 words on masking tape pressed to the casing. In her shaky but unmistakable script, it read, "For Ray." Listen. Sophie plugged it into her laptop. A single audio recording, 47 seconds, dated 8 days before Diane died. File name, 2 a.m. She pressed play. The ambient hiss of a quiet room, the mechanical rhythm of an oxygen concentrator, the faint beeping of a heart monitor, the soundscape of Diane's bedroom during those final weeks, when the hospital sent equipment home because there was nothing left except making the waiting comfortable. Then Marcus's voice cut through, low and urgent, coming from the hallway outside the bedroom door. He was on the phone. The baby monitor on Diane's nightstand, kept from when Marcus was an infant, was still active. He had forgotten it was there, or assumed his mother was too deep in morphine to hear. She was going to find out about the insurance change, Cam. His voice was stripped of every ounce of public charm. The hospice nurse mentioned reviewing the policy documents with Dad next week. If she sees the beneficiary form before the claim is filed, the whole structure collapses. Camille's voice came through fainter, from Marcus's phone speaker, but the baby monitor caught it clearly. Then, we adjust the variable we can control. The chemo schedule is the easiest to modify without raising questions. Talk to Patel. He understands the timeline. We need to accelerate, Marcus replied, exhaling without grief or hesitation. Another 2 weeks, and Dad will have the paperwork on the kitchen table. We do not have 2 weeks. 47 seconds. A son planning the acceleration of his mother's death to protect a stolen insurance policy. Camille. Treating a dying woman's remaining days as a scheduling conflict. Diane heard it through the baby monitor in the dark. Alone. While morphine held her body still, but left her mind clear enough to understand what her son had become. She did not confront him. She did not call me. She reached for the baby monitor on the nightstand and pressed record. Then, during those final 8 days, she transferred the file to a USB drive and hid it in the false bottom of the toolbox that sat in our bedroom corner. The toolbox, her son called junk. The toolbox, she said, held everything that mattered. Have you ever realized that the person you lost was still fighting for you from the other side? Diane could not hold a spoon. She could barely open her eyes. But she found the strength to press a button and hide the evidence in the only pair of hands her son would never respect. Sophie's face was wet. She did not wipe the tears. She turned her screen toward me and pulled up photographs from Marcus's cloud backup. Marcus and Camille on white sand, turquoise water behind them, cocktails in hand. The location tag read Grace Bay, Turks and Caicos. The timestamp was 3:17 in the afternoon. Diane's funeral started at 3 o'clock. While I stood in the rain watching the only woman I ever loved lowered into the earth, my son was ordering drinks on a beach paid for with her stolen death benefit. I closed the toolbox. The metallic snap of the latches rang through the suite like a hammer striking a coffin nail, echoing off marble and silk and crystal that had never known the weight of real grief. Diane did not just leave me a toolbox, Sophie. My voice came from somewhere beneath the rubble of everything I thought I knew. She left me a demolition order, and the building she wanted torn down is the life our son built on her grave. Derby Day arrived not with the warmth of a Kentucky morning but with the sharp electric tension of a countdown that only I could hear. I had not slept. The baby monitor recording had played on a loop inside my skull for 4 hours, Marcus's voice overlapping with the mechanical rhythm of Diane's oxygen concentrator, until the two sounds fused into a single frequency of betrayal that I could feel in my teeth. I stepped into the hallway at 7:30, the ivory carpet muffling my boots into silence. The corridor smelled of fresh linen and the faint sweetness of magnolia drifting through the ventilation from the gardens below, where the wedding staff was already assembling white chairs in rows that faced the crystal pavilion. Through the tall window at the end of the hall, I could see Louisville waking into its biggest day. The distant spires of Churchill Downs rose against a cloudless sky, and somewhere out there 100,000 people were placing bets on animals they believed would carry them to fortune. I was not betting on horses. I was betting on the truth. And the truth had never lost a race it was actually allowed to run. The elevator chimed. Marcus stepped out like a man exiting a limousine, his charcoal suit cut so precisely it looked like it had been designed by the same architect who drew the hotel's blueprints. His shoes reflected the hallway's brass sconces. His hair was styled with the kind of deliberate carelessness that takes 30 minutes and $200 to achieve. He froze for half a second when he saw me, his eyes performing a rapid calculation before his face rearranged itself into an expression of weary compassion that he wore the way other men wear cologne, applied in the morning, designed to make an impression, and completely artificial. "Dad," he said. And the word sounded like a label rather than a name. He stepped closer, his citrus cologne arriving before he did, sharp and expensive, and nothing like the sawdust and coffee smell that used to cling to the boy who rode on my shoulders at the county fair. "I was hoping you would get some rest. You look tired." "I look exactly how a man looks after his son sells his house from under him," I replied, keeping my voice as level as a chalk line on a foundation wall. The compassion mask flickered. Annoyance crossed his features, like a shadow passing over a freshly painted surface, there and gone before most people would notice. But I had spent 43 years reading the faces of contractors who were trying to hide defective work behind confident smiles, and Marcus's face was the least convincing structure I had ever inspected. "Dad, we talked about the house months ago." His voice dropped into a slow, careful cadence. the rhythm of a man speaking to someone he has already decided cannot keep up. You signed the papers because you wanted to simplify your life after Mom passed. We went over this together at the kitchen table. Do you not remember? He spoke loudly enough for the hallway cameras to capture every syllable of his performance. The concerned son. The patient caretaker. The man who had to explain reality to a father whose mind was slipping away like sand through a cracked foundation. Every word was a brick in the wall he was building around my credibility, and he was laying them with the practiced ease of a man who had been mortaring lies since before his mother's body was cold. I remember everything, Marcus, I said. And I let the weight of that sentence settle between us. I remember the house. I remember the insurance. I remember Lorraine. Something moved behind his eyes at the mention of his aunt's name. Not guilt. Marcus had burned through his supply of guilt years ago. It was the flicker of a man recalculating his position after discovering that the ground beneath him is not as solid as the survey promised. But he recovered fast. He always recovered fast. That was his gift and his curse, the ability to repaint a crumbling wall so quickly that the crack disappeared before anyone could photograph it. Aunt Lorraine's death was a tragedy, he said, his voice softening into a tone so rehearsed it could have come with stage directions. And I understand that your grief makes it hard to separate what happened from what you wish had happened. That is exactly why Dr. Patel recommended the evaluation. It is not a punishment, Dad. It is protection. Have you ever stood 3 feet from your own child and felt the distance of an ocean? Not the physical space between two bodies, but the vast, cold expanse between a man who built his life on truth and a man who built his on the wreckage of everyone who trusted him? I kept my hands still at my sides. The silver watch on my wrist was recording every word, and I needed Marcus to feel safe enough to keep talking. A foreman learns early that the most dangerous cracks reveal themselves when the structure is under the least apparent stress. Let the man believe the inspection is over, and the defects start showing. If you step into that ballroom today, Marcus continued, his voice dropping to a register that the cameras would not catch, but that I felt vibrating in my sternum, I will have Pruitt put you in restraints for your own safety. The paperwork is already signed. 1 phone call and you are in the back of a medical transport before the appetizers are served. He leaned in as he said it, close enough that I caught the sharp underscent of sweat beneath the citrus cologne. The polish was cracking. The foundation was shifting. And that was when I saw them. On his wrists, catching the morning light from the hallway window, were a pair of gold cufflinks. Small, round, engraved with a date I would recognize in my sleep. June 14th, 1980. Our wedding day. Diane had given me those cufflinks on our 25th anniversary, and I had worn them to every formal occasion for the next 18 years. Marcus had told me they were donated to a charity auction during the estate clearing. He was wearing my wedding day on his sleeves. He was decorating himself with the date his mother pledged her life to me, using it as an accessory to impress the family of the woman he was marrying with money stolen from the woman who had given him life. Marcus reached out and patted my shoulder. The gesture was performed for the cameras, a loving son comforting a confused father. But his hand on my body felt like a snake testing the temperature of its prey. Order the steak, Dad, he said, his public voice returning with full volume as a bridesmaid rounded the corner. Go back to your room. Get some rest. I want you to feel good for the photos. He turned and walked toward the grand staircase, his movements fluid and rehearsed, descending the marble steps without looking back. He was so certain he had won that he did not notice the one detail a foreman would never miss. His right hand trembled as it gripped the banister. A wall can look like it is standing long after the load has exceeded its capacity. It takes a trained eye to see the lean. And Marcus was leaning. I watched Marcus disappear down the grand staircase, his trembling hand smoothing itself against his jacket the moment he reached the landing where other guests could see him. The mask went back on like fresh paint over a crack. And by the time he crossed the lobby, he was smiling again, shaking hands with a silver-haired man in a seersucker suit who looked like he owned something that produced dividends. I turned away from the window and headed for the courtyard. I needed air that did not taste like Marcus's cologne or the funeral sweetness of hotel lilies. The service corridor led me through a side exit and onto the estate's formal garden, a manicured rectangle of boxwood hedges and white limestone paths that radiated from a central fountain like the spokes of a wheel. The morning sun was already heavy, pressing the scent of warm magnolia and freshly turned mulch into the humid Kentucky air. Derby Day energy hummed beyond the hotel walls, distant brass bands, and the rhythmic clip of horses being walked to trailers. But inside these hedges, the world was silent except for the steady splash of water on stone. Camille Duval was waiting for me. She stood beside the fountain basin in an ivory power suit that made her look less like a bride and more like an attorney arriving to deliver a verdict. Her posture was architectural, every angle calculated, every surface polished, to project exactly the image she intended. She was not surprised to see me. She had been expecting me, which meant Marcus had already reported the hallway encounter, and the next phase of their coordinated demolition was already in motion. She did not offer a greeting. She adjusted the slim gold watch on her wrist and sighed, a sound so precisely calibrated it could have been scored by the string quartet. "You were given instructions to stay upstairs, Raymond," she said, my first name landing like a stamp on a legal document. "You are making this very difficult for Marcus." "Marcus made this difficult when he sold my house and stole my wife's insurance," I replied, stopping 10 feet from her. The white gravel shifted beneath my boots, the sound loud against the quiet garden. "I am just here to see the foundation crumble." She did not flinch. She smiled, and the smile was a revelation. It was the expression of a woman who had never once confused kindness with strategy and who understood that sentiment was a construction material used exclusively by people who could not afford steel. She reached into her clutch and produced a single sheet of cream-colored paper, extending it toward me with a grace that felt more like a blade being offered handle first. She called it a severance agreement. The language was deliberately vague, packed with legal qualifiers and conditional clauses that would take a team of attorneys 6 months to untangle. If I remained silent through the ceremony and signed away any claims to the Duval partnership, Marcus would consider returning a portion of the Sycamore Lane proceeds within 18 months. "Think of it as a temporary accommodation for your son's future," she said, her voice low and reasonable, the same tone I imagined she used when negotiating the acquisition of distressed properties for below market value. "You will get your home back when the dust settles." I looked at the paper and then at her. "I have spent my life measuring the strength of concrete, Camille. I know when a beam is hollow, even when it is painted gold. I am not signing away my sanity for a promise made by people who steal from the dead." The melodic composure vanished. The temperature of her voice dropped to the point where I expected to see my breath in the warm May air. She stepped closer, her heels clicking on the limestone like the cocking of a firing pin. "Refuse, and you will not just lose your house, Raymond," she said, her eyes locking onto mine with a precision I recognized from my own work. The precision of someone who measures a target before cutting. "You will lose the right to choose your own doctor, your own food, your own life. We will have you declared legally incompetent before the cake is cut. You will be a ward of the state by sundown, and Marcus will be your legal guardian. Have you ever been threatened with erasure by someone who smiles while they do it? It is the most efficient form of violence I have ever encountered, because it leaves no mark on the body while dismantling everything inside it." "You are threatening to bury me alive," I said, my voice dropping to the register I used when condemning a structure in front of a city board that did not want to hear it. "But you forgot one thing. I am the one who knows where the cracks are." Marcus appeared from the West Wing entrance, moving fast, his confidence replaced by the jerky urgency of a man who has just discovered that his schedule is no longer under his control. He was carrying a heavy cream envelope, and he thrust it toward me with hands that were no longer trembling. They were shaking. 50,000, he said, then corrected himself. 60,000, Dad. Cash. Right now. There is a black car waiting near the service entrance. It will take you anywhere you want. Camille's father will set you up somewhere comfortable, You will have everything you need. The envelope was thick enough to bend under its own weight. I could see the green edge of $100 bills pressing against the cream paper. My son was offering me a lifeboat made of the same money he had stolen from the people I loved. I did not reach for it. I did not blink. I let the envelope hang in the space between us, until gravity became an accusation, and then I let it fall. The packet hit the white gravel with a dull thud, the paper splitting slightly to reveal the cash inside. Green against white, like a wound on clean skin. "I will see you at the altar, Marcus," I said, stepping around him. "Make sure your vows are worth the concrete they are poured on." I walked back through the garden without turning around. Behind me, I heard Camille's heels clicking rapidly on the stone as she moved toward the west wing, and the faint rustle of Marcus retrieving the envelope from the gravel. As Camille reached the door, she pulled a small embossed napkin from her clutch to dab water from her sleeve, then let it fall as she stepped inside. I waited until the door closed before picking it up. A scribbled note in her sharp handwriting confirmed what the insider had already told me. The signing had been moved from 10 to after the ceremony. They were adjusting on the fly, which meant they were scared. Back in the suite, Sophie had the condemnation report spread across the coffee table. Every document, every recording, every forged signature organized with the precision of a structural failure assessment. But she had found something else on the hotel's internal server. Philippe Duval had hired a private investigator to examine Marcus's finances 2 months ago. More importantly, Philippe had personally authorized the hotel security system to allow me unrestricted movement through the building, overriding every lockdown order Marcus had filed. "You are not alone in this building, Uncle Ray," Sophie said. "Philippe Duval wants you at that ceremony as much as you want to be there." I looked at the clock. 2 hours until the processional. I looked at the condemnation report. I looked at the closet, where my old inspection suit hung waiting. "Then let us give him something worth watching," I said. The suit hung in the closet like a ghost waiting to be summoned. Dark navy wool, single-breasted, with narrow lapels that had gone out of fashion and come back twice since I first wore them, to the dedication of the Lincoln Heights Elementary School Gymnasium in 1989. That was the same gymnasium whose trusses I had fought the city council to reinforce, the same building where Elijah Moss had nearly lost his life to a collapsed scaffold years later. The suit had attended every building dedication, every safety board hearing, every ribbon cutting, and every condemnation notice I had ever delivered in 43 years of making sure the structures people walked into would not fall on their heads. I took it from the hanger. The fabric was heavier than I remembered, the wool carrying a weight that had nothing to do with thread count. It smelled of mothballs and cedar, the scent of a career stored in a garment bag at the back of a closet in a house that no longer belonged to me. I held it at arm's length and looked at it the way I used to look at a blueprint before the first pour. Every line had a purpose. Every seam had a load to bear. I dressed slowly, the white shirt buttoned with the steady patience of a man who has done this 1,000 times before walking onto a site where someone else's shortcuts were about to be exposed. The trousers fit looser than they had at my retirement dinner. 7 years and 20 pounds of grief, having redrawn the dimensions of the body Diane used to call her favorite structure. The jacket settled onto my shoulders with a familiar heaviness, and I felt the posture correction that comes with wearing something that was built for a purpose larger than vanity. Then I reached into the inner pocket and pulled out the small metal case I had carried in that jacket since 1982. Inside, resting on a square of worn velvet, was my OSHA construction foreman's safety compliance badge. It was not decorative. It was the credential that gave me the legal authority to enter any construction site in the state of Ohio and order work stopped if I found conditions that endangered human life. I had used it to shut down school projects, hospital renovations, and highway overpasses when the men who signed the checks did not want to hear that their budgets had compromised the concrete. I pinned it to the left lapel. The sharp metallic click of the pin engaging the wool sounded like a round being chambered. A small mechanical declaration that the man wearing this suit was not here to observe. He was here to condemn. I turned to the mirror. The gilded frame held a reflection I had not seen in 7 years. Not the confused retiree in flannel that Marcus wanted the world to see. Not the grieving widower who had handed his life to a son who used it as building material. The man in the mirror was a foreman. Straight-backed, clear-eyed, with a silver badge on his chest and a steel toolbox full of evidence behind him. He was the man who had once stood in front of a packed city council chamber and told them their brand-new civic center would collapse within 18 months if they did not replace the substandard rebar their contractor had substituted to save $11,000. They had laughed at him. The building was evacuated 14 months later. "This site is condemned, Diane." I whispered to the empty room, feeling the silver watch warm against my wrist. "I am just here to clear the building before it falls." Sophie was at the coffee table, her fingers making final passes across her keyboard. She had uploaded the baby monitor recording to 3 separate encrypted cloud servers, each one accessible only with a passcode she had memorized and a biometric confirmation that required her fingerprint. Even if Marcus somehow found and destroyed the USB drive and the laptop, the 47 seconds of his confession would survive in the digital atmosphere like dust from a demolished building, impossible to sweep away entirely. Elijah confirmed the sound system in the Crystal Pavilion is running through the hotel's central audio server, Sophie said without looking up. "He cannot give us direct access without leaving a trail. But he left the auxiliary input panel in the east alcove unlocked. I can patch the recording through a wireless bridge from my phone. It will take 11 seconds from the moment I hit send to the moment Marcus's voice fills the room. 11 seconds. The time it takes a condemned building to realize it is already falling. The condemnation report is complete," she continued, sliding the manila folder across the table. I picked it up and felt its weight. Every forged signature, every stolen dollar, every manipulated medical record, every email that had turned my phone calls into symptoms, organized and tabulated with the same meticulous precision I had used for 43 years to document the hidden failures in other people's structures. This folder was the final inspection report on the life of Marcus Hollister, and the conclusion was unambiguous. The structure was unsound. The occupants were at risk. The building must come down. My phone rang. The screen glowed with Marcus's name, the letters vibrating with an urgency that I could feel through the glass. I answered. The voice on the other end was not the polished CEO or the patronizing son or even the desperate man who had tried to buy my silence with $60,000 in a garden. This was something new. This was the sound of a man who had just discovered that the ground beneath his empire was not solid earth, but a thin crust over an abyss. "What did you do?" Marcus shrieked, the distortion in the phone speaker turning his voice into something jagged and unrecognizable. "Philippe has frozen the joint escrow accounts. The entire Duval partnership is on hold. If you talk to him, if you showed him anything, I will make sure you spend the rest of your life in a room with no windows." I held the phone steady. "I did not have to show him anything, Marcus. A man like Philippe Duval does not invest $12 million without running his own inspection. You built your company out of dry straw and expected me to provide the shade. I am just the one who finally lit the match." The line went silent for 3 seconds. Then Marcus's breathing returned, shallow and rapid, the respiratory pattern of a structure under terminal stress. "You have no idea what you have done," he whispered. "I know exactly what I have done," I replied. "I read the site report, and the site is condemned." I hung up and slid the phone into my jacket pocket beside the silver watch. Sophie was standing by the door, her phone in one hand and the wireless audio bridge in the other. She looked at me the way I imagined the apprentices used to look at me when I walked onto a job site that everyone else had signed off on and said the 3 words that made contractors lose sleep. I picked up the condemnation report and tucked it under my arm. I checked the watch one final time, not for the hour but for the recording indicator. It pulsed steady and green. Every word Marcus had just screamed was already part of the file. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The carpet swallowed my boots, but the silence did not last. From somewhere far below, rising through the floorboards and the plaster and the bones of this building, came the deep, resonant voice of a pipe organ, beginning the wedding processional. The music swelled through the corridors like a tide, heavy with simulated grandeur. The processional had begun, and so had the demolition. The organ pipes shook the crystal pavilion like thunder rolling through a canyon. 400 guests sat in white chairs beneath a ceiling of hanging wisteria and Edison bulbs. Their faces turned toward the altar, where Marcus Hollister stood in his charcoal suit. Hands clasped, jaw set, waiting for his bride. He looked like a man who had already won everything. I stepped through the service entrance behind the last row. Nobody noticed at first. The processional hymn was loud, the string quartet layered beneath the organ, and every eye was fixed on the double doors at the far end where Camille would appear. I moved along the east wall, my steel-lewed boots silent on the marble runner, the condemnation report pressed flat inside my inspection jacket. The OSHA badge caught a sliver of chandelier light and threw a small gold flash across the nearest chair. A woman in the third row turned. She saw the badge, the jacket, the hard expression, and her smile faded. She nudged the man beside her. He looked. Then the woman behind him looked. The ripple moved forward, row by row, like a crack spreading through a load-bearing wall. By the time I reached the midpoint of the aisle, 30 people had stopped watching the doors and started watching me. Marcus had not seen me yet. He was whispering something to his best man, a Duval cousin in a navy blazer, and his eyes were on the ceiling as though calculating the cost of every hanging flower. I kept walking. My heartbeat was loud in my own ears, but my hands were steady. 43 years of climbing scaffolding and wind had taught me that shaking comes after the job, never during. The hymn ended. In the 4 seconds of silence before the bridal march, I reached the front row. Marcus turned. His face went white. Not pale. White. The blood left his cheeks so fast I could see the veins in his temples, thin and blue, pulsing like cracks in fresh concrete. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The best man stepped sideways, confused. The officiant, a silvery-haired pastor in a black robe, raised both hands as though directing traffic. I did not wait for permission. I walked past the first pew, past the floral arch dripping with white roses and eucalyptus, and stopped 3 feet from the altar. The microphone was on a brass stand to the left of the officiant. I reached it before anyone could react. My voice came through the pavilion speakers, clear and low. My name is Raymond David Hollister. I am 70 years old. I am a retired construction foreman, OSHA certified, with 43 years of structural inspections across the state of Ohio. I have inspected hospitals, bridges, courthouses, and schools. I have never once signed a report I did not believe. And I am here tonight to deliver the final inspection of my career. The silence was absolute. 400 people. No one breathed. I opened my jacket and removed the condemnation report. 14 pages. Spiral-bound. Red cover. I set it on the altar between 2 candle pillars. This document contains evidence of a forged power of attorney used to sell my home at 40% of market value. Evidence of a life insurance beneficiary change executed 11 days before my wife's death using a forged signature. Evidence of a fraudulent investment scheme that stole $130,000 from my sister Lorraine and contributed to her death. Evidence of unauthorized financial transfers totaling $80,000 drained from my accounts in 4 minutes. And evidence of a recorded conversation in which my son Marcus Hollister and his fiancée Camille Duval discussed accelerating my wife Diane's chemotherapy schedule to hasten her death. Marcus lunged. He grabbed the edge of the altar and shouted, "He is not well. Someone call security. He has dementia." This is exactly what I warned you about. I pressed play. Sophie had uploaded the audio to the pavilion's auxiliary panel. Elijah had left it unlocked, just as he promised. The speakers crackled once. Then Diane's baby monitor filled the crystal pavilion with the sound of my son's voice at 2 in the morning, 8 days before my wife died. Marcus's voice, recorded and undeniable, said, "The benefit transfers in 14 days. If she makes it to the next cycle, the The paperwork window closes. We move the schedule forward. The hospice nurse won't question it. File the form by Friday. Camille's recorded voice answered. And your father? Marcus again. He trusts me. He will sign whatever I put in front of him. The recording lasted 47 seconds. In those 47 seconds, I watched my son's life collapse the way a condemned building collapses when the last support is cut. His knees did not buckle. His face did not crumble, but something behind his eyes went dark, like a circuit breaker tripping in a building that would never have power again. Camille appeared at the double doors in her white gown, veil raised, bouquet trembling. She heard the last 8 seconds of her own voice. The bouquet hit the marble floor. White petals scattered like ash. Philippe Duval stood from the second row. He was a tall man, silver white-haired, in a dark suit that cost more than my truck. He did not speak. He simply nodded once toward the service entrance. 2 plainclothes officers from the Louisville Metro Police Department stepped through the same door I had used. Derek Pruitt, the hotel security chief, met them halfway. He was carrying a printed copy of the conservatorship petition, the fabricated psychiatric evaluation, and the email chain between Marcus and Camille. He handed it to the lead officer without a word. Marcus looked at Camille. Camille looked at Philippe. Philippe looked at the floor. The officer approached the altar. Marcus Hollister, you are being detained for questioning related to financial fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Please, step away from the altar. Marcus did not move. For 3 full seconds he stared at me. And in those seconds I saw something I had never seen in my son's face. Not anger. Not fear. Recognition. He finally understood that the foundation he had built his empire on was rotten, and the man he had dismissed as old and confused was the only inspector who had ever bothered to check. He stepped away from the altar. The officer guided him toward the service entrance. 400 guests watched in silence as my son walked past the wisteria, past the Edison bulbs, past the string quartet that had stopped playing, and disappeared through the door. I turned off the microphone. I picked up the condemnation report. I looked at the empty altar, the scattered petals, the candles still burning. Then I walked back down the aisle, through the silence, through the stairs, through the heavy scent of white roses and eucalyptus, and stepped into the Kentucky night where the air smelled like warm grass and approaching rain. Sophie was waiting by the service door. She had tears on her face, but her laptop was open and her jaw was set. The cloud backups held, she said. Every server confirmed. The audio is preserved in 3 locations. They cannot erase it. I nodded. My hands were shaking now. The job was done. The shaking could come. Somewhere inside the pavilion, a woman began to cry. Then another. Then the murmur started. Low and rising, like wind before a storm that has already passed. I sat down on the stone bench beside the garden fountain and set the toolbox on my lap. The brass latch was warm from being carried against my chest. I ran my thumb across the dent where Diane had dropped it off a ladder in 1986, the year we moved into Sycamore Lane. The year everything was still sound. I got him, Diane, I said. The fountain answered with the only sound that mattered. Water. Falling steady. The way it always does, when the structure beneath it holds. The next 72 hours moved the way concrete sets slow, irreversible, and heavy enough to hold whatever you pour into the mold. Louisville Metro Police transferred Marcus from the Belmore estate to the downtown processing center on West Jefferson Street before midnight. I know because Sophie tracked the booking number online and read it to me from her laptop while I sat on the edge of the Heritage Suite bed, still wearing my inspection jacket, still smelling white roses on my sleeves. Booking number 2024 ULM 08847. My son reduced to 7 digits and a hyphen. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the leather chair beside the window and watched the city lights reflect off the Ohio River. And I thought about the afternoon Marcus was born. Diane had squeezed my hand so hard, she left a bruise shaped like a crescent moon on my palm. I kept that bruise for 11 days. I used to joke that it was the first mark my family ever left on me. Now I understood it was also the most honest. Sunday morning, Derby Day. The investigation expanded. Detective Lieutenant Carolyn Maddox arrived at the suite at 9:15 with a recorder, a legal pad, and a face that said she had already read the condemnation report twice. She was in her early 50s, short gray hair, no jewelry, no wasted words. She reminded me of the senior engineers I used to work beside on highway projects, people who measured everything before they spoke. She asked me to walk her through the timeline. I started with the text message on Friday evening and ended with the audio playback at the pavilion. She did not interrupt once. When I finished, she set her pen down and said, "Mr. Hollister, I have been a detective for 23 years. I have never had a victim hand me a case this well organized." I told her I was a foreman. Organization was the job. She took the original deed, the original insurance beneficiary form, the USB drive, and a copy of the condemnation report into evidence. Each item was photographed, logged, sealed in a clear plastic bag, and signed by both of us. I watched my wife's handwriting disappear into an evidence envelope and felt something tear inside my chest. Quiet and final, like a thread pulled from old fabric. By Monday afternoon, the forensic accountant assigned to the case, a young woman named Priya Ranganathan from the Kentucky Attorney General's office, had traced every dollar. The $40,000 to Duval Capital Partners, the $25,000 to the Delaware routing number, the $15,000 to Duval Holdings. She mapped them on a whiteboard in the precinct conference room, and when she stepped back, the lines looked like the schematic of a building designed to fail load paths that led nowhere, connections that carried no weight, joints that were never meant to hold. She also confirmed that the sale of 4412 Sycamore Lane had been executed using the forged power of attorney, notarized by Victor Payne, Marcus's personal counsel. Payne was arrested at his Lexington office on Monday evening. He did not resist. He sat behind his mahogany desk and said, "I want to make a statement," before the officers finished reading his rights. His statement filled 9 pages. He named Marcus as the architect of the entire scheme. He described meetings at the Duval family's lake house in Prospect, where Marcus outlined the partnership requirements. Philippe Duval demanded proof of independent capital, and Marcus had none. Everything Marcus presented to the Duval Group, the property holdings, the insurance payout, the legacy fund, belonged to me. Payne said he raised objections twice and was told both times that Ray Hollister was elderly, confused, and unlikely to notice. Unlikely to notice. I read that line in the transcript and set the paper down and walked to the window. I stood there for a long time, watching a barge push upstream against the brown current of the Ohio. On Tuesday, the Franklin County Coroner's Office in Columbus reopened Diane's case at the request of the Kentucky AG. Dr. Elaine Yoon reviewed the original hospice records, the pharmacy logs, and the chemotherapy schedule maintained by Diane's oncologist at Mount Carmel East. Her preliminary finding, delivered by phone to Detective Maddox at 4:17 in the afternoon, was that Diane's final chemotherapy infusion had been moved forward by 6 days without documented physician authorization. The scheduling change was requested via a patient portal message sent from an IP address registered to Marcus Hollister's office on Broad Street. Dr. Yoon did not use the word murder. She used the phrase medically significant, unauthorized intervention, contributing to accelerated decline. I understood. In construction, we do not say a building was destroyed. We say the structural integrity was compromised beyond recovery. The language is different. The result is the same. Margaret Okafor, Diane's hospice nurse during the final 2 weeks, provided a sworn statement on Wednesday. She described a phone call from Marcus 4 days before Diane's death, in which he asked whether adjusting the timing of treatment would affect the insurance filing window. Margaret told him that was a medical decision, not a financial one. He hung up. She documented the call in her personal notes but never reported it because, she said, she did not want to believe a son would do that to his own mother. I forgave her when I read that line. I understood, not wanting to believe. Hank Jessup, the Belmore Estate's head of maintenance, provided physical evidence on the same day. During a routine inspection of the hotel parking structure, he discovered a brake fluid reservoir cap on Marcus's Tesla had been loosened and a slowy drip puncture made in the rear brake line. The car had been parked in the VIP level since Friday evening. Jessup reported the tampering to Detective Maddox, who added it to the case file as a potential secondary charge, an apparent attempt to create a mechanical failure that could be blamed on Ray Hollister's truck, which was parked one level below. By Thursday, the case had grown into something larger than one family's ruin. Philippe Duval's attorneys issued a statement severing all business ties with Marcus Hollister and Duval Holdings LLC. The $14 million partnership was dissolved. Philippe himself called the precinct and offered to testify that he had authorized the private investigator and Ray's unrestricted hotel access because his own due diligence team had flagged irregularities in Marcus's financial disclosures months earlier. He told Maddox, "I wanted the old man in the room. He was the only honest variable." On Friday, 1 week after I pulled into the Belmore Estate Valet Circle, Marcus Hollister signed a plea agreement in the Jefferson County Courthouse. The charges included first-degree fraud, forgery, elder financial exploitation, conspiracy to commit conservatorship abuse, and involuntary manslaughter related to the unauthorized alteration of Diane Hollister's medical treatment. The plea carried a combined sentence of 18 years in a Kentucky State Correctional Facility with eligibility for parole review after 12. I was in the courtroom. I sat in the third row, the same row where the woman at the wedding had first noticed my badge. Marcus stood at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit. He did not look at me. His attorney entered the plea, and the judge asked Marcus if he understood the terms. Marcus said, "Yes, Your Honor." His voice was flat, emptied out, like a building after the wrecking crew has taken everything but the frame. The judge accepted the plea. The bailiff led Marcus through the side door. I heard the lock engage from 15 feet away. A hard, metallic sound, final and clean, the sound of a bolt finding its seat. Sophie was beside me. She put her hand on my forearm and squeezed once. She did not speak. She did not need to. I walked out of the courthouse into pale November sunlight and stood on the limestone steps and breathed. The structure had been condemned. The demolition was complete. Now it was time to clear the site and decide what to build next. Spring came to Columbus the way it always does, slow, uncertain, and then all at once, as though the earth had been holding its breath through winter and finally decided to exhale. I moved back into 4412 Sycamore Lane on a Tuesday in late March. The Franklin County Court had reversed the fraudulent sale in January, and Duval Holdings LLC had surrendered the title without contest as part of Philippe's cooperation agreement. The house was mine again. The same porch, the same cracked sidewalk I had poured myself in 1995. The year Marcus started kindergarten and Diane planted the first row of tulips along the front walk. The tulips were gone. Whoever had maintained the property during the 5 months I was away had mowed over the beds and left bare dirt where the colors used to be. I knelt on the cold ground that first morning and pressed my palm flat against the soil. It was still good. Dense, dark, Ohio clay, with enough give to hold roots. I drove to the garden center on Olentangy River Road that afternoon and bought 60 bulbs, red, yellow, white, and a pale purple that Diane used to call almost lavender. I planted them before sunset, row by row, using the same spacing Diane had marked with popsicle sticks 30 years ago. My knees ached. My back seized twice. I did not stop. Some things you rebuild because the blueprint is already in your hands and the only cost is effort. The white dogwood in the backyard had survived everything. Neglect. An early frost. A season without pruning. When I walked out the kitchen door on that first morning and saw it standing against the gray March sky, bare branches reaching upward like fingers stretching after a long sleep, I put my hand on the trunk and stood there for a while. The bark was rough and cold. I could feel the life underneath it. Patient and stubborn. The way trees are. The way Diane was. Sophie visited on weekends. She had taken a cybersecurity position with a firm in Short North, 20 minutes from Sycamore Lane. And she brought coffee and spreadsheets and updates I did not always want to hear. Marcus had filed an appeal in February. His new attorney argued that the plea had been coerced and that the Baby E monitor recording had been obtained without consent. The appeals court denied the motion in 9 days. Sophie read me the ruling over her laptop screen, and I nodded once and changed the subject to the dogwood, which had started to bud. I did not visit Marcus. He wrote me a letter in April. 4 pages, handwritten on lined paper. I recognized his penmanship, the same tight, forward-leaning script he had used on homework assignments at the kitchen table, while Diane made pot roast and I read inspection reports under the overhead light. The letter said he was sorry. It said he had not understood the weight of what he had done until the courtroom door locked behind him. It said he thought about Diane every night, and that the sound of the bolt was the last real sound he remembered. I read the letter once. I folded it along the original creases and placed it inside Diane's toolbox, in the hidden compartment where she had kept the evidence that saved my life. I did not write back. Forgiveness is a load-bearing decision, and I was not ready to test whether my structure could hold it. Maybe someday. Maybe not. I had learned that honesty about your own limits is the first rule of any inspection. Lorraine's grave was in Greenlawn Cemetery on the south side. I went on a Saturday in April, the first warm day, and set a pot of yellow mums beside the headstone. The inscription read, Lorraine Elise Caldwell, beloved sister, and the dates underneath were too close together, 58 years compressed into a hyphen. I told her about the trial. I told her about Sophie, how strong she had become, how much she looked like Lorraine when she frowned at a screen. I told her the money was being recovered. The Attorney General's restitution order had clawed back 81,000 of the 130,000 Marcus had stolen, and the remainder was expected within the year. I told her I was sorry I had not seen it sooner. The wind moved through the cemetery oaks, and I chose to believe she heard me. In May, I did the thing Diane would have wanted most. I used a portion of the recovered insurance funds to establish a skill-to-trade scholarship at Lincoln Elementary, the school on Parsons Avenue where Diane had volunteered every Thursday for 11 years, reading to second graders. The scholarship covered tuition, tools, and first-year housing for graduates entering construction, electrical, plumbing, or welding apprenticeships. I named it the Diane Hollister Foundation for Built Futures. The principal, a tall woman named Constance Avery, called me into her office to sign the paperwork and told me that 14 students had applied in the first 2 weeks. I signed my name on the foundation charter, my real signature, steady and mine, and thought about all the forged versions that had been used to dismantle my life, and how strange it was that the most powerful thing a signature could do was build something instead of destroy it. Elijah Moss sent a card from Louisville. He had been promoted to general manager of the Belmore estate after the Duval family restructured its hospitality division. The card said, "The scaffolding holds, Ray. Come visit any time. Your suite will be waiting." I pinned it to the refrigerator beside a photograph of Diane holding a trowel in the backyard. Her gardening gloves too big for her hands, her smile wide enough to make the whole frame bright. On a Sunday morning in late May, I carried a folding chair to the pedestrian bridge over the Scioto River. It was the bridge I had inspected 19 times during my career: expansion joints, bearing pads, deck overlay, railing welds. I knew every bolt. I knew where the concrete had cracked in the flood of 2004 and where the patch held and where it didn't. I set the chair in the middle of the span, sat down, and opened the toolbox on my lap. The hidden compartment was empty now. The deed was back in my filing cabinet. The insurance form was in the Attorney General's evidence archive. The USB drive had been entered into the court record and sealed. Diane's lavender handkerchief was the only thing left inside, folded into a neat square, still carrying the faint ghost of her perfume. Something between vanilla and cedar, a scent I could never find in any store because it was not a product, it was a person. I held the handkerchief against my face and breathed in and let the river move below me. steady and south, the way it had moved for 10,000 years before anyone built anything on its banks. A jogger passed behind me and nodded. A family on bicycles crossed going east, the youngest child ringing a bell that sounded like a small, happy alarm. The sun was warm on my arms. The dogwood at Sycamore Lane would be in full bloom by now, white petals trembling in every breeze. Alive and unconcerned with anything except the ordinary business of growing, I closed the toolbox. The brass latch clicked solid, seated, precise. The sound of a thing built right. I stood up, folded the chair, and walked home. The structure was sound,